Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to season 3 of Cloud Security Podcast. I am really excited about another season starting with all of you, and I am also excited about the fact that I get to start off with my favorite topic as the first month of Cloud Security Podcast. So we're talking about identity and access management, and I could not think of a better episode to start with. Some of the most at least some people made the simplest problems that exist in the identity and access management space, authorization. So to get into this, before we get into the topic, let me just bring on my good friend over here. Oh, wait, sorry. I totally forgot the intro music. Give me 1 second. Let me just bring you back. So forget everyone. This or didn't come in at the moment. Let me just. I totally forgot. So here we go. Hey, welcome. Or good to see you, and apologies for that interesting. I was like, wait, I forgot something. I'm like, yeah, that's what I forgot. But thank you for coming in, man. I'm so glad I could have you here.
We're really happy to be here.
Yeah,
and it's an honor to be the first guest for your third season.
Yeah, I'm super excited as well, man. I think, and I can see already people coming in as well, so that's pretty awesome. But I have this tradition of I ask people to get something to drink. So cheers, man. Thanks for coming in. What'd you get for the coffee? What's your drink today?
Yeah, so I'm drinking English tea, English breakfast specifically,
Nice.
with a bit of honey and milk, just like you're supposed to drink it. So I really like strong tea, but with a bit of milk to make it a bit nicer on the tongue.
That's pretty awesome. By the way, for reference for people who may be watching this, it's 11 p.m. on your time. So I appreciate your going like a strong tea when it's closer to midnight. Hopefully after you finish this interview, you can go to bed, man.
But there's a bit more work to do, but yeah, don't worry.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, that's good to hear. So we've got a few people coming in as oh hey Vineet, hey welcome man, Happy New Year Vineet. We've got a few more people coming in. So let's get into this, man. I think for people who may not know who OR is, first of all, if you can tell us a bit about yourself, and also how'd you get to where you are right now, man? What's your story?
Sure. So essentially, I'm sort of a cliche of an Israeli entrepreneur. My background starts in the intelligence core in the IDF, or as I was a developer, officer, team leader, project manager, yada yada yada. A lot of hardcore software and reverse engineering. I then proceeded to work in a couple of startups. Worked in a startup called Intigo, where we did containers before containers were a thing, but with a really bad go-to-market. And afterwards, I worked in another few startups. I worked as a consultant back in the Ministry of Defense, and I was a VP of R&D in a cybersecurity company that catered to governments, like-minded agencies worldwide. But I only worked on defensive projects, not offensive. Really proud of that, especially with the current climate nowadays. And afterwards, between I think late 2016 and up to 2 years ago, I co-founded and ran as CEO a developer tools company called Rookout, which enables production debugging. Still a board director there, still major stakeholder, but currently I'm working on Permit.io, my new company, which, as you kind of mentioned, focuses on identity access management and more specifically on authorization and access control. And you can see throughout my career and background, cybersecurity and software development were always a key element. And with this company, I really enjoy combining them both software development, working and providing solutions for developers, and putting that focus on security, but from the dev side.
Oh, wow, man. Really interesting story. By the way, Permit.io is an interesting name as well, because you guys have called it something else before, right? So why that name? And I think there's a story behind that as well, right?
Yeah. So first of all, technically, we're still in stealth mode. We haven't did any announcements yet. This podcast is kind of an exception. We'll be doing more announcements later in this new year. We were previously called Authorization, which was just kind of a pun. I'm not saying a good pun, but a pun on authorization and horizon, because authorization is an unending horizon of things that you need to do. But we had a problem where people were reading authorized as authorization, and If people can't read
Right.
the name of your company, that's a bit of an issue. So we were lucky enough to be able to get the domain permit.io from another great entrepreneur. And now that's what we're called, permit.io.
That's awesome, man. A great name as well. I've got a few more people who just came in as well. Hey, hi, Blay. Happy New Year, man. Martinez, Happy New Year from warm London. Oh, appreciate you guys joining in that late as well. So there you go. We've got a few more people who are awake late in the hour. Welcome, Martinez. Welcome, Neil, Bilay, and welcome, Vineet. All right, let's get into this, man. So I think you and I have been talking about identity and access management for some time and offline as well, but a lot of people may not be aware of what identity and access management is. So just so that we can level the play field for everyone, how do you describe, I'm going to throw a few words and pick anyone to start off with. How do you describe authentication, authorization, access control? Because they sound very similar.
Right. They're shortened in a very similar way. So you have authentication, which people would call often auth-n, and you have authorization, which people would shorten as auth-z. So they both
Yes.
have auth in them. So it's super
Yep.
confusing, but they're very different. And they're all part of this bigger space called IAM, or Identity Access Management. I like to think of identity access management as a waterfall composed of three parts. The first part is identity management. So identity management is all about managing your identities, as the name indicates. It's
Mm-hmm.
about being able to define who's part of the organization, what attributes they have, which departments they do belong to, and just have the ability to create identities and aggregate them, cater them, manage them in a unified kind of interface. Most leading solutions for identity management are Okta and Azure Active Directory. People also use Google's IAM for identity management, and that's really the baseline for identity access management. And while identity management takes part on the organization side, the other two parts happen on the product side. They connect to identity management. So
Okay.
the next stage is authentication. So authentication is all about verifying the identity of who's connecting into a product. There you'll find products like Auth0, Cognito on AWS, OneLogin, etc., etc. And then you proceed from that verifying your identity, essentially logging in. You proceed into the product, and then you need to decide who can do what within the product. And that's called authorization. So who can do what in which contexts? That's authorization. And you have common questions like which users can use which features,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
who can do what. So identity management is managing the identities. Authentication is who's at the door. And lastly, authorization is once people are in your house, in your product, what are they allowed to do? Are they allowed to sleep in your bed, eat in your kitchen, set things on fire? It really changes, but it's important to make those decisions.
Hopefully not set them on fire, I guess.
Unless that's something you're into, I'm not a judge.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I won't judge people when they come into the house. Yeah, feel free to set your fire. It's not like my house is your house kind of thing. Like burn it if you want to. So I think so. By the way, that was great. Great, almost like a chain that we kind of went through, which
Yeah,
is authentication, authorization. Sorry, yeah, go on.
it's more than a chain. It's actually a waterfall. So they feed one another. So you have to have the first layers. So you can have the following layers. If you don't have identity management, you don't have some source where you can query identities, you can't really verify them. And if you don't have identities, it's really hard to build authorization, because if you don't know who that person is or who that entity is, you can't really decide what they're allowed to do as opposed to other entities.
Yeah, and I think it's funny as in how nuanced this thing as well, right? It's almost like you have a product, and I think I'm going to summarize this really quickly as well. I think it'll be great. You have a product, and every product you can either have it open to the internet. Anyone can just go in and do whatever they want on it, which is kind of like what we all do with Google. And then there are products
Mhm.
like I'm going to use a Facebook as an example. Like I get a special ID for for me to log in into for my profile, but I don't get access to everything in Facebook. And that's that separation of authentication, authorization. And access control is how much, like, you may decide to block me as a friend, And because like, oh, Ashish is always live streaming every weekend, so I hate him for this. So you may decide to just go, you know what, I'm just gonna block him. So my access is basically limited at that point to you. So like there is that another example of access control as well.
Yeah, that's a terrific example. And it also works in multiple levels. So you have who can access the solution itself, who can work with it in the infrastructure level, who can manage it as a developer, and who can work with it as a user. And the thing is, the more products we have and more things we connect one another, there's more and more need for authorization. It used to be a lot simpler, and it was a lot easier for developers too. Everyone would start with I just need two types of users in my app, admin and not. And now it's kind of exploding, and there are multiple levels of authorization. For example, what am I allowed to do in the application? What do I allow the application to do on my behalf? What data do I allow the application to use? It also kind of trickles down into privacy, and it's become a very complex space.
Yeah, and I think maybe a good place to start also is clearly we have been, we've done this for a while. Initial conversation was just, hey, I just want to admin, non-admin. Now, coming
Yeah.
from there, a lot of people may be wondering, so what are some of the common authorization methods that people see in the industry right now?
So up till recently, like the last 2 years, people have been mostly building authorization on their own completely. So you just build it from scratch. I was also one of those people. In my previous company, Rookout, I ended up rebuilding authorization 5 times. That kind of uh, turned on a light bulb for me that something is wrong here. And new solutions started to evolve, open source ones and services, etc. And I think the most dramatic change that caused this to be different than it used to be before is microservices. So when you're building a monolith application, you have the ability to kind of bake in just one place how you control who connects to what within the application. Usually,
Mhm.
also if you use some specific frameworks like Spring Framework or Django in Python, you also get some of those controls baked in. But as you
Yep.
start to break that application out into multiple services, now you end up replicating the authorization code across these different
Oh.
microservices, and that then makes it very hard to do. And the way to approach that is recognize that now you have it kind of spread, and then also recognize that you have more needs on top of that. So the logic now is not just I need admins or not. We, as I mentioned before, there are more requirements. Like we need
Mm.
different users, we need different roles, we need to control it according to different attributes. And I can maybe kind of take this further, but I don't want to rush the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. Fair enough. And I think it's a good thing to mention, to the point that it's so easy to kind of feel like you would have the best solution for authorization because it should be straightforward, right? I just need to and especially when the product is starting, I don't imagine it to be like, oh, it doesn't need to be complex. Let's just get this out of the door. One admin, one non-admin, and just don't worry about it after that, right?
I call that applying the salami method to yourself. So it's like, oh,
Salami.
I just need a small slice, just a small slice. And then a user comes in and, oh, they actually need an editor role. And then a user comes in and, oh, we actually need audit logs and we need to be able to monitor them on our own side. And then sales comes in and we need impersonation. We need to be able to see the system from our own eyes. Or at Rookout, like it's also things that you don't really think about. Like at Rookout, one of our partners, Cisco, they started to sell Rookout directly to market. And then they came in one day and said, we want our own back office. We want to be able to manage the users that we onboard into the system. And I was like, there's no way in hell I can take this solution and stretch it to be that way. I have to rebuild it from scratch. So, and now that because it's also spread across multiple microservices, I need to rebuild multiple microservices over and over. So
Yep.
it's really because of the complexity and because of the new technologies we're working with, it really requires a new mindset, new best
Mm.
practices, and new technologies to kind of address this challenge.
Because I think, and that's probably a good segue into, like, there obviously have been existing solutions in the past, and some people are still using those solutions as well. Either they've gone down the product path or they've gone down the path of, like, to your point, made custom authentication authorization for their products, which seems to be the easiest way because you already have developers. Now, why are, I guess, the world we live in right now with microservices, cloud native, it just so complex in terms of the kind of compute you can go for as well. But why is there a need to kind of challenge authorization at this point in time? And I think you kind of talk about permit.io as your new company that you kind of focused primarily on authorization. So why challenge authorization now, and why is it not working, or is that why we're challenging this?
So there are two reasons why this is a point in time to challenge this. Firstly, it wasn't really applicable before. We had to solve the previous layers. We had to have identity management work well. We had to have authentication work well, and we had to have those interconnected. So until we had SAML and SSO connect between identity management and authentication, that basically that entire area wasn't stable enough to build upon. And before we had standards like JSON Web Tokens in the authentication layer, it was basically impossible to connect to it in a standardized way. JSON Web Tokens are a really great way to communicate from the authentication layer into the application, and specifically into the authorization layer. And they became mature just in the last like 2 years, three, if we were kind of kind to it.
All right.
So first of all, the technology and space wasn't there yet. And secondly, the mindset wasn't there yet. We were still evolving in how we were thinking about microservices. If you
Okay.
go 5 years back, people were still thinking like, oh, billing is something that I'll implement on my own, and authentication, that's too core and critical. I have to implement it on my own. But thanks to these companies like Stripe and like Auth0, now people realize that these are really hard problems, and there's no reason that you should be building them from scratch over and over again. And the mindset that you can adopt critical services as part of an application you're building became legitimate. And more than that, now the consensus is that you have to adapt these kind of solutions, because trying to build it on your own, you'll probably make a lot more mistakes and it will be a lot more pain for you. So state of mind is ready for that.
Mhm.
And in parallel, the complexity, like I mentioned before, the complexity of both the demand for more advanced authorization and the spread for it in the complexity of the applications themselves, moving to microservices and cloud native structures, really made the pain of building it into application by itself a lot bigger, a lot more painful. So having the two work together, both the space ready and the pain kind of reaching kind of a threshold, that really was a signal for us that new tools should be built here. And thankfully, we, both us and other players in the market, started with open source. So there are now solutions that even if you don't buy, you can already kind of adopt them as building blocks, and more importantly, as best practices that you can kind of bake in to make sure you don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and be
Mhm.
ready how you're building authorization.
It's an interesting point as well, because you almost wonder that, you mentioned cloud native and cloud platforms as well. Because obviously, if you talk to someone from AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, or any of the cloud service providers, they would just say, hey, you should use our authentication. And you kind of mentioned Cognito in your example earlier as well when we started this conversation. So at what point would one decide that, hey, because I'm not going to answer my own question, but why would someone choose to go down, say, an open source path for authorization, or versus just using a cloud platform solution for it?
So I think it doesn't really matter how you choose to address this. You need to understand the complexities of it, and how that's essentially the best practices that you need to adopt, so you won't find yourself constantly rebuilding this. And you can approach this also by building on your own. That's still an option, but you should build it on your own the right way. Then you can, instead of reinventing the wheel, you can take ready-made solutions as open source or as services, and you can build on top of them, also kind of to avoid the mistakes of the common mistakes.
Hmm.
And as in terms of like choosing a solution or choosing something of your cloud, it's really important to understand also the difference here in adopting authentication and authorization. So authentication is really at the gateway of your application. It's just a door, and once people pass through it and you get a JSON Web Token, you're kind of free of it. It's not deeply ingrained. Authorization is a lot more critical. Essentially, most applications would do multiple authorization queries per request per microservice in the application you're building. So it's a lot more performance critical. It's a lot more. It has a lot more impact on the application, and also there are a lot more interaction points. So if you don't get those interaction points right, you're
Yep.
gonna have a bad time. And getting those right is adopting those best practices. The first one, by the way, is decoupling policy and code. So having essentially a separate microservice for authorization, and then building the microservice right, having it based in a way that you can load policies and data into it in an easy fashion, making it event driven so you can update it quickly as things change. And
Hmm.
there are a few more best practices that we'll touch on in a minute, but you can build that microservice. Again, as I said, you can build it on your own. You can adopt open source like OPA, Open Policy Agent, which is
Yep.
part of the CNCF, which is essentially a fancy memcache that you can load policies and data into and then run queries on it. But it's a fancy memcache that is actually fancy. It comes with good performance. It comes with good APIs and best practices in how to manage that component. And then when you want to take it to the scale of your application, you can take open like Opal, which for a disclaimer, I'm one of the maintainers and developer of. And Opal enables you to take Opal and make it event driven, and then it can sync with your application in real time. So you can build all of those on your own. You can re-implement them in a different way, but it
Hmm.
would be most importantly for you to recognize that these are complex problems that require good design, and b that there are already good solutions out there that you can build upon and not find yourself constantly rebuilding from scratch.
And I just want to point out for people who are trying to be future security architects and probably already are architects who really relate to the problems that you just mentioned as well. Because authentication is just a gateway to your product. It's probably step one beyond before you open the Pandora's box for, oh, is it Ashish from security, or is it Ashish from marketing, or is it Ashish who has admin privileges versus admin who's non-admin? Like you can, like the number of questions you kind of have to kind of think about in authorization is just so complex, and that's why
Yeah.
I'm sure there's so many companies that have departments that are just dedicated for identity and access management, nothing else. They just work on that.
Yeah, and also it's getting more complex by the minute. Just maybe I'll try to paint a quick picture so people can maybe wrap their heads around why this is complex. Because on the surface of it, it sounds simple, but just
Hmm.
thinking of where do we manage the identities? Is it coming there only from the identity management of the customer? Are we adding more information on that on top? Are we adding information from external services? How quick do those sync? How do we make them consistent? So is the information coming from identity management? Is it found in the JOT, the JSON Web Token? Is it found in our database? Is it found in a third-party service? So maybe I'll give one example here. Let's say we want a simple policy, like only users that have paid for a feature can use it. It's again, it sounds very simple on the surface of it, but it's very complex. First of all, we need to know who this user is, and
Hmm.
maybe other attributes on how are they supposed to pay and how they are going to use different features in the system. This can already touch on both the authentication layer, the JSON Web Token, and some elements in our database. But
Hmm.
then it also touches on a third-party system. Billing today, or pricing or paying, is not implemented in your system, in your database. It's implemented in a third-party service like Stripe or PayPal.
Hmm.
And we want that to be quick. So when someone swipes a credit card or types in their credit card in Stripe, we want that information to propagate immediately into our application so that user can start using now.
Yep.
So we essentially need to be event driven. When the event happens in Stripe, we need to be able to listen to it and update our authorization layer accordingly. And then when the user comes in, and that's a different request coming in, running in a different application, we need everything to chime in the right moment so it will work smoothly. And we just described the most basic policy you can basically think of.
Yep.
And it still can be super complex.
It is, and a great example as well, by the way, because at the on the surface, such a simple thing. Yeah, I just we pay it and move on, but it's quite a complex one to solve it. I'm gonna take a switch gear because I've got a few more questions coming in as well. Hey Tom, happy New Year, man. Good to see you as well. Tom has a question as well. What problem or opportunity are you trying to address in the IAM world with your new company?
Yeah, it's a very simple question. So we're working on full stack permissions as a service. So what I'm describing here, essentially with authorization or permissions or access control, are all the challenges that you have to go through just to get to the basic step. And then it never ends. It continues. You constantly have more demands and you constantly have more requests from customers, from partners, from your sales, your marketing, your product. It never ends. And as a developer, in the end of the day, you don't want to deal with all of that. You just want to be able to build your actual product. So just like you don't want to implement billing from scratch and you don't want to implement authentication from scratch, there's no reason to build access control from scratch. So what we're trying to do is kind of cover it end to end. Unless you want to build something, in which case you can, but unless you want to, you don't have to build anything. You can just plug and play access control both on the infrastructure, back office, and customer facing interfaces. You can just plug them in and have your product have all it needs to have for access control without you having to build anything. And also have it in a way that the different stakeholders can come in and work on this. So it starts with developers. Developers are always the ones that, in the end of the day, are requested to build these features into the products and applications. But it obviously is required by other players like product, security, compliance. So for security, for example, the ability to have audit logs for the entire system per tenant and have those be fed into your SIMSOC and other monitoring systems is a critical thing. You'll need to do that. And you need to enable those security people to control that, configure that, and have all the information they need to be part of managing the system. So that's what we're trying to do. We want to enable the developers to empower everyone else in the organization without having to build this from scratch over and over again.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Or. And hopefully that answered your question as well, Chom. Good to see you, man. All right, I've got another question from Vinny. What is your approach when you design authorization at large scale, especially when they want more granular access for different users? That's a great question as well.
Amazing question. So first of all, I'll start with saying that we as a society or as humanity, we don't really have a concrete answer for that yet. So with authentication, how you should manage the identity, how you should pass it along, for example, we have a very good answer. JSON Web Tokens are based on good cryptography and battle-tested protocols, and we know that's the default go-to. With authorization, the space is still evolving, which is kind of cool, but also kind of intriguing. So there are two camps today: the powered by code camp and the powered by graph camp, and they both have pros and cons. On the powered by code camp, you have solutions like OPA, which I mentioned before, and also other great solutions like OSO and Casbin. These are essentially engines that you load data and policies into based on code, and they execute them to following queries to answer who can do what. If people are familiar with Prolog or Datalog, those engines are basically based on that kind of mindset, that expert system mindset. The advantages of those agents and engines is that they are very organized. You have a specific language in OPA, for example. There's a language called Rego, and also you have a language called Polar. Both enable you to write code that is efficient and focused on building permissions. And you can distribute those agents across your system, and that with the microservice approach, having them, for example, as a sidecar or a cluster, really solves your scaling out challenges. And they are performant. They will give you the performance you need to be able to use and scale in your application. But they have downsides. You now need a way to keep them always in sync, and you need to make sure that they're consistent. So if you have multiple microservices, you need each of them to be in sync with you, so you don't give permissions on one request and then another on another. So that's one camp. I try to give kind of pros and cons quickly. The other camp is really led by a white paper from Google called Google Zanzibar. And Zanzibar is essentially a graph-based concept on how you manage the world picture of your authorization. So think about your different entities as nodes on the graph, and the connections between them, the relationships are what will define access control. So let's say, for example, in Google Drive, which is based on Google Zanzibar, you'll have a folder which would contain a folder, which would contain a folder, which will contain a file. And to the top folder, we say Ashish has access, read access. So we'll have a node coming in from the top file, and from there called read, and from that we'll have a connection to the user that is connected to Ashish's identity. So when we want to answer who has access to that file, we navigate on that graph up to Ashish, and then we can say Ashish has access to that file through all those folders. The main advantage of the graph-based approach is that we can navigate the other way around. So we can ask, that's what's called the spice. Who has access? So not only does Ashish have access, who has access to this file? So we can run the graph the other way around, which we can't do with code, right? Code only runs one way. But the challenges with it is that we're managing basically a huge graph in our cloud. It doesn't really fragment well. We can't really put it as a sidecar next to each of our services. And then if we were using it as an external service, we'll usually pay a large cost in network latency. So that's problematic. The kind of approach that I think the market would kind of stabilize on, that's my kind of prediction, is a hybrid approach. So we'll be managing the greater picture in a graph. We'll be running the queries locally in kind of a deduced image that will be saved in specific agents that are local to each microservice. And that kind of, you can get the best of both worlds. By the way, another challenge that the graph-based approach has is, aside from managing just the complexity of that graph, which is really hard to do, is also how complex you can make the permissions. So with code, it's really easy to make loops and iterate, or even be recursive. If you make that graph directly acyclical, you'll be running into a really bad time, because you'll end up looping a lot on the graph and not being able to actually answer questions. So you're limited in what you can describe with that graph as opposed to code. Again, that's another where they're kind of complementary, and why I feel that the hybrid approach is really the way to go. But we'll see, the market's still evolving. What's cool about using the best practices and using solutions like Permit.io is that we're just kind of abstracting this for you. We'll combine whatever approach the market has, hybrid, non-hybrid. You can just consume it through our APIs, and no matter what changes, what ends up being the ultimate solution, you'll just get it. You don't have to kind of rebuild it from scratch, which is also something I think can be very helpful if you want to focus on building your product.
I think you did a good talk on this as well. Can't remember, it was like a couple of months ago or something, or was it like a meetup talk I found it on a YouTube channel, which is really interesting. It actually has the diagram of the waterfall that we spoke about earlier as well.
Yeah.
And it speaks about the two kinds of approaches, the policy agent approach as well as permission graph approach. I think that's what I'll do is I'll add that to the show notes so people can actually go to that talk and listen to that talk as well.
I think,
that'd be a great one.
I think maybe it's the talk that I gave in Cloud Native London.
Probably that one, yeah. That's
so
the one.
I both covered the different approaches and the best practices. So there are 5 best practices. Again, even if you choose to build on your own, which is fine, or build with open source, just make sure you cover the best practices so you won't end up rebuilding from scratch over and over.
Do you recommend people start on their own first so they know how hard the challenge is?
Yeah. It's all a matter of, like, you're building a product. You have different requirements at different points in time. You need to have priorities and decide what's important for you now. As long as you stick to the best practices, you can end up upgrading. You can then shift. But if you choose the wrong design, you'll have to rebuild from scratch. So you can build that microservice on your own and then switch it with open source, or switch it with a third-party service, or switch it with something else you'll build later. But if you end up embedding it in your code, you're going to have a bad time. Don't do that. If there's one take from what I'm saying now, don't embed authorization into your code. Decouple it. That's maybe the most important best practice.
Yeah, hopefully that answered your question, me. But that was a great question as well, man. So it's sort of worthwhile calling out the two kind of approaches, because a lot of people have been. I mean, I haven't been a security architect in the past. A lot of times the conversations just would end at the part of, hey, why aren't we using single sign-on? And when people were asking for authorization, and that way we have one central point to control who Ashish is and what Ashish can do, whatever the access thing is. But to your point about added complexity with now different kinds of cloud native, cloud workload, and all these other things, right? So what's the now? So clearly we've moved beyond from, hey, just do a single sign-on and it'll be all good, and we have a lot more complexity around it. So what are some of the best practices people can look forward to? And it could be, to your point, a hybrid approach to the policy method or policy graph or permission graph method. But what are some of the best practices you recommend?
So before I dive into the more of the best practices, maybe to touch on that point with with single sign-on. So single sign-on is very important. It's a good solution to have, and a lot of customers would require it anyway. So it's a good approach, but it covers a very small part of the picture because
Salami
you only
approach.
need the different attributes that the user has that are not necessarily part of the identity management. For example, which country are they connecting from right now? Maybe you want to limit that according to geolocation. Are they connected through a VPN or not? That can also be another attribute. Are they? How much of their quota have they used? And you can really, it's really easy to see how this complexity moves on, and it also really changes between different products. And also, it might be one way in a product today, and next release or next feature requirement or next audit or compliance that you have to go through, it would change. So it's really important to understand that single sign-on is okay, but it gets more complex and it increases in complexity per the overall market and per product throughout time consistently. That's something that you can really bet on easily.
Oh,
So going into the best practices, so the first one we already kind of mentioned, decoupling policy and code. Have a separate microservice. So people often ask me, is it okay to have a separate library? It's okay, but it's usually not enough. If you have a library and it compiles in a different fashion or is integrated in a different fashion into different microservices, you also often find yourself having a bad time because you end up having different microservices with different versions of the authorization layer. And then keeping them consistent is really painful. So ideally, you should aim from day one to have a separate microservice for authorization as soon as possible. Even if that microservice is just a Lambda function that always returns true, or just checks the username is your name and returns true, it would be better. But separated from day one. So that's the first best practice. The second best practice is have things event driven. So consistency is very important and very hard. And the space is, by definition, is going to be distributed because you have a different billing service that is external to you. You have a different authentication service. You have a different third-party database. You have a different third-party quota solution, marketing solution. You're going to have a lot of different solutions that are part of the overall thing you're building, and they're going to be run in an async fashion and remotely from you. So if you're not able to work in an event-driven fashion, the complexity of the data, the distributed data plane, is essentially going to end up making you have a bad time. So try to build or think of a design that it's going to be event-driven. It doesn't have to be fully event-driven from day one, but you should take that into account. So if you take those two, by the way, if you take the first two best practices, you can easily achieve them with open source, for example, by taking OPA and then taking Opal. So OPA will give you a separate microservice, and Opal will enable you to keep it in sync with a pub/sub solution in an event-driven fashion, in a real-time fashion. Again, you can build those on your own, but there are solutions that are already made open source that you can just adopt. The third best practice and fourth best practice are really about how you work around the microservice and distributed data layer. So the third best practice is building a back office. That's something that you should recognize on day one. You're building it as a developer now, but other people are going to use this. DevOps would need to be able to control this and take effect. Security, compliance, product, sales, professional services, etc., etc. Essentially, everyone that's building the product will need to be able to manage the product. So you need to build your interfaces on top of that authorization microservice from day one to enable other interfaces for other people. So enable, so for example, security to see the audit logs. Enable sales and professional services to create new tenants. Enable product managers and compliance to audit or change the policies. So you want to build interfaces, both APIs and UIs, on top of that authorization layer. And you need to manage, you need to design that authorization layer to support that from day one. Second part is very similar. So your people need interfaces, but your customers also are going to require interfaces. So they want to manage some of their policies on their own. They want to be able to add users on their own and assign roles on their own and assign attributes on their own and be able to see their own audit logs. They'll ask, how can I see what my users did within your system? It's going to happen. If you're building a B2B product, it's going to happen sooner or later. So take that into account. Build the APIs and design to support that from day one. Think about how you are going to scale that data so it will become available as part of the audit log, for example. And lastly, that's really about, I think my main preference is GitOps. So we need to kind of take all these layers that we mentioned, that decoupled microservice, the event-driven layer that synchronizes the different agents, the interfaces that we have on it, and we need to find a way to constantly upgrade this and keep it with the times. And the way that I think is most battle tested and proven for this is GitOps. So you should manage your policy as code. You should manage the configuration of how you load the events in that event-driven pipeline through configuration in your repositories. And then you are able to push changes. You are able to control this in a unified way that is focused around code. And you can make it in a way that is both auditable and controlled. So you know who changes your authorization layer. There's an entire whole space of authorization for authorization, which is super recursive and super confusing. I won't dive into it right now. But starting with GitOps is a really good way to kind of have a baseline to work with that and not get lost on day one.
So it's a good way to talk about the best practice as well, because it's such well, even the OZ or R, there's a lot of confusing terminology there as well. I was also going to add, it's also worthwhile calling out a lot of people who may be listening to this. They might have maybe not even in front of a monolith app, right? Or they might be using a monolith app instead of like a microservice cloud native app. And some of these solutions may or may not work there, right? Like I don't imagine a monolith app would have the, well, it can have flexibility, but what is that something can work for monolith apps as well, or is the approach for this only like a modern cloud hosted cloud native kind of app only?
So it's easy to integrate into a monolith app. The challenge would usually be that if you've built a monolith app, it already has a lot of authorization kind of baked into it. So the most of the pain would be to go around cutting the areas that you already kind of glued together with the existing authorization. But if it's decoupled enough, or if you decoupled it, it's really easy to just plug in an SDK call to the authorization layer. That authorization layer can be baked in, kind of compiled into the monolith, and it can still be a separate service. Even monolith applications today use separate services like databases and queues. So having essentially a authorization agent is essentially a fancy database. You can think of it with Memcache. So you can think of it like Redis. So it's not that different to query it. You just need to write interfaces between your monolith or main service and that authorization layer. And what we're seeing today anyways is, unless with applications that are being deprecated, they're being added more services in kind of SOA architecture. So adding that additional service would usually make sense. And I find myself talking to a lot of companies, both large ones like banks that approach us and smaller ones like startups that are saying, "Oh, we've built this monolith, but we know that we'll have to move to microservices in like a month or two. What should we do so that transition would be not as painful?" And first of all, in general, we're happy to help with that. We're always learning from people coming with those challenges. But also the basic answer usually is start with the best practices, understand how complex your data is or going to be, and then we can kind of go step by step and think how we can kind of break it down and make it easier.
So, and yeah, because for people who may not know what monolith applications are, this is how we've been developing applications for years now. This is the example that, or you started off with by saying, "Hey, I'm going to build my own authorization and authentication." That's when there was no standard, there was no single sign-on, there was none of that stuff. So all those applications are still pretty elephant-like, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think like if we glimpse quickly in the past, like if you were in like early, late 2000s, most applications were still mostly proprietary code. And then they move and then you just say, oh, it's all my code. Let's compile it all together, create one binary, run it. And the end of the day, we'll also, in most cases, you delivered still a physical server, either on your network or to the customer's network. So it was like, yeah, anyways, we'll just build it all together. We're doing it anyway. And
Yeah.
then we moved to, oh, we are going to deploying this in containers in the cloud. So we probably should break this down and use other services. And then we started and we moved from being almost like 90% proprietary, we moved to like 50% proprietary, 50% open source.
Mm,
Nowadays, applications are already 90% open source, and they're starting to be more and more third-party services. So it's no longer just not your proprietary code; it's not your proprietary service. It's running on someone else's cloud, and this momentum, this trajectory is just going to expand dramatically.
I agree.
Um, and the way we are building applications in that fashion forces us to break it down to more components because we have to connect with more components.
Yep. I think it's a good exercise for anyone who's probably listening in, just to see how they do authorization even today. And that's an easy way to identify if you are currently working with a monolith application or microservices. And because there's a lot more complexity. I think Or and I are just touching on like scratching the surface over here. Truly, there's a lot more deeper level that you can go into this as well. I'm just conscious of also the fact that we kind of talk about a lot of best practices. We've spoken about some of the modern approaches as well. But in terms of maturity, I guess when people look at this and go, like they've heard what you and I have said, they've gone ahead and had a look at what they have under the bonnet, I guess, of their applications. Oh, I have a monolith, or I have like a microservice. I'm using a sidecar approach or whatever. What do you see as maturity for authorization? As if people were to kind of benchmark themselves for, hey, this is level 1 and this is like level 10. What are some of the maturity scale graphs that people can look at to match themselves against?
So if you kind of align that with the best practices, I think the kind of the negative level would be jumbled spaghetti code for authorization. So you have a lot of copy paste code between different services, between different applications, and a lot of it is replicated and also duplicated, and also it started to drift from one another. That's also one of the big challenges when you're not decoupling. So you
Hmm.
have that code, and then another developer creates a new service or a new function. He just copies it over, but changes it slightly. So that's like the worst. Then when you want to add a new feature, change a new layer, that's very painful because you need to refactor across multiple services, and there's not even a consistent way that the refactor would go because you need to kind of snowflake each and every function call. So that's horrible. If you're at that state, you should really consider setting time to face that technical debt and manage it before you'll actually have to find it. Otherwise, you'll be spending. I've heard companies spending on average like 8 months on doing that
Oh.
refactor with like for a whole team. Super painful. Really, it's better to avoid doing that under stress from like a feature request or demand from auditor. So try to
Mm.
avoid that. The step above that is having code that is you kind of merged into the application code itself, but it's at least organized. There's some APIs that are set. There's separate functions. That's kind of a better step. Above that is a separate library. Have a separate library that you can kind of compile or build into your product that manages the um, authorization. And lastly is taking that library and moving it into a separate microservice. And then ideally having that microservice be based on battle tested, mature solutions. And you can see that what I described it is also a way to kind of gradually migrate into something better. You can also identify the different areas where you have different pain points and gradually migrate them into that better best practice. And if we're already talking about maturity, maybe it's worth to mention what's the maturity of the solutions available out there today. So we mentioned OPA. OPA is a very mature solution. It's a CNCF project that is graduated. It means it's on the same level as Kubernetes in terms of kind of peer review and usage. And Opal, which I mentioned, while not a CNCF project, is a project that complies with the CNCF and is already being used in very mature companies in production, like Tesla and Accenture, Zapier, for example. So it's also very mature and you can kind of count on it. And there are other solutions out there. I won't obviously mention everything, but there are also good solutions around Zanzibar, Ori, and specifically AuthZ are, I think, good mentions there. That area is still a bit more kind of nascent, but it's getting there. When you're trying different solutions, when you're picking them, it's really important that you match the level of maturity of your application and the scale that it has with the maturity of the product, and kind of go step in step with them to make sure that you get what you need.
Yeah, all great advice there as well. And definitely start by looking at what you already have. And sometimes what you might find is you can't really change things really quickly in a monolith, but I will let you discover that. Now, we're obviously talking about OPA, Opal, and I think I definitely want to leave some references for people to, like, where can people find out more about this, man? I think I always find that it's such a complex topic, and we only have a limited hour-long episode to talk about
Yeah.
something which has been evolving for 20 plus years, I guess. So, what are some of the good, I guess, learning, or I guess, what are some of the resources you recommend for people to learn about Opal and other things around authorization?
Terrific question. So what I really like, and one of the things that always gets me gravitating back to developer tools, is working with other developers and the community. So both OPA and Opal have very vivid communities that you can come in, ask questions, see examples of what other people have built, learn from their experience, learn from their mistakes, join in discussions. That's really, I think, the best way to kind of jump into this. See what others are building, share what you're building, and get feedback on it. That's a great start. Both OPA and Opal have Slack communities. You can just join them directly and ask questions, show and tell there, etc. Both are also very active on GitHub, both in the sense of contributing code, but also seeing other project examples or discussions. People are very welcome there, and both use the kind of CNCF conventions of welcoming people, so it's a very inclusive environment. So that's a really great place to start. And obviously there's the reading materials for both, like the documentation, both for OPA, you can find it on openpolicyagent.org, and for Opal, you can find it in opal.ac. It's pretty easy to dive in. And maybe we've been a bit kind of, I don't want to be too fear-mongery. I think authorization is a big challenge, but I don't think people should be too wary of it. A lot of times people come in and they think, oh, I have a lot of data and I don't know how to manage everything. And it's going to get messy, and maybe I should just stick with just shoving it in there. I don't know. And often when you take the first step and you actually look at what you have in place and where you need to be at, the next step that you need to take is usually very simple. Usually you have less data than you actually think you have that you need to manage. Usually you have a lighter scale that you can just manage naively at first, and then you can go there step by step. And they're already kind of battle-tested architectures that you can copy off other people, see from the community, adopt them, and just start that from that and kind of gradually build on. And I encourage people to do that because A, it will save them pain later, and B, it's fun and it's a cool bunch of people, and I think you'll enjoy connecting with them.
That's great advice as well. I just had a question come in from Vishwas on the YouTube thing. What is your view on YAML that is vulnerable today? How are we going to change the approach when we are considering the security today with policy and governance? I didn't realize YAML was vulnerable.
So it depends on what I mean with YAML being vulnerable. I don't think that they necessarily mean a vulnerability in the kind of parsing or execution of YAML as part of a system, because then it really depends on what your YAML parser is. Maybe there's a specific one that is vulnerable, I don't know, in like Node or Java, but
Oh yeah,
the Python one would probably be okay.
yeah.
I think they're probably meaning just having that critical information being concentrated in one place kind of becomes a crown jewel that if people get access to,
Oh yeah.
can affect, have a wide effect on your system and the basic access control and general controls that you have.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah.
so for that, I think it's really important to go back to those best practices. So one, you shouldn't have everything in one YAML. You want to decouple your authorization layer, and you want to understand that you have different layers of authorization. So you have authorization or access control. You have physical access, right? You put locks on keys on your doors to the office, where the computers that have access to the cloud are positioned. And then you have network level access control like firewalls and zero trust networks and VPNs. And then you have infrastructure level access control, like which servers can talk to which service in Kubernetes. And lastly, you have application level access control. So first of all, you don't want all the access control to be in one place. That's essentially stupid. Just think about putting the physical keys in the YAML file or something like that. It just doesn't make any sense. So separate into those layers, and within those layers, also separate it to the different services that you have. You don't have to have everything in one place. It also, aside from not having everything concentrated and vulnerable, it will be easier for you to manage just in your head and with your team in a repository. So you can have multiple repositories there, multiple microservices that you manage separately. And then you still want to have organized controls into that. You don't want to just have chaos. You need to have authorization for your authorization. And the best place to start there, I think, is GitOps. So you manage who can commit what and what test checks and balances they need to go through before that change is applied into production, and also other environments. So you should also have staging for your access control, just like you have for every other critical service that you're maintaining. So if you separate it into layers, separate it into services and silos, and have a clear way, focused in code or configuration to access it and have controls and checks and balances on top, you should be in a good place. And the other way around, obviously. There's a lot more to talk about access control for access control, but we should probably keep that for a different
For
different
another hour episode, I guess, another day as well. But no, that's a great answer though, man.
Thank you. I tried.
Now, and hopefully that answered your question as well, which was. But let me know in the comment as well if we have another question after this. But we're also on the last segment of the episode as well. This is just basically fun questions, not technical at all, just so that people get to know you a bit as well. Just three, not too many as well. So the first one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on technology, like authorization, cloud, and all that? So what do you spend most of your time on?
So aside from spending time with my lovely wife, I spend my time a bit of exercising. I like to swim, and I'm really a ferocious consumer of books. So I read a lot and I also write quite a bit. My most favorite book that I kind of recommend to a lot of people is The Selfish Gene, and now I'm re-listening to The Blind Watchmaker, both by
Okay.
Richard Dawkins. As an engineer, I find the world of evolution and biology super inspiring. Just having it being kind of broken down to fundamentals and understanding how they have kind of cascading effects and emergent phenomena is just I'm always inspired by that, and I always find links in when I'm building software and architecture and thinking how it will evolve, and also when like being as an entrepreneur thinking of how I'm going to take something to market, how I'm going to have people connect with a message. There's always an element of evolution there, starting from the scaffolding, moving into kind of what's called in biology the red queen hypothesis. Things evolve through the pressure of the other elements in the environment. So that's why you want, as an entrepreneur, you want to connect with the world as soon as possible. So that's what I kind of enjoy spending my time on.
Cool. And say another question for you then. What is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Proud of that is not on social media.
Yep.
Uh, um, so there's a podcast that I do on my own. It's in Hebrew, so it's not accessible, I guess, for most viewers here. But it's called Buzzwords, and it's a podcast about technical concepts that are explained to the layman. Like, so we have an episode on Kubernetes. We explain it in like 30 minutes in a way that a layman can understand. And
Wow.
also vaccines, and an episode about different developer types, and on machine learning. So I'm pretty proud of that. I do it as a hobby, um, but um, but it's not. It doesn't have like a. Also because it's in Hebrew, it's not really widespread. Um, and another thing that I'm really proud of is books that I've written. I haven't published them. I've written them mostly for my own benefit and kind of sharing with friends, but
Nice.
I'm proud of what I've wrote.
Wow, I did not realize you were an author and a writer as well, man. That's pretty awesome. So it's really interesting to be with other colleagues in cybersecurity who have so much more talent than just being an entrepreneur or just being, I guess, a really great technical person. I've got one more question, and then we can close the show. What is your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Ooh, favorite cuisine or restaurant. So I'll give two recommendations. One in Tel Aviv, and one in San Francisco. In Tel Aviv, there's a Asian fusion restaurant called Taizu. It's kind of fancy, but it just makes really great food. So they kind of combine the local kind of flavors with the wider Asian cuisine, and it's just really tasty. That's all I can say.
Cool.
It's a bit on the fancy schmancy side, but it's good food. And on a really different side of the spectrum, there's a small cafe called Moe's Cafe in San Francisco, not too far from Paul Station.
Right.
Um, it's I when I land in San Francisco, usually it's a 16-hour flight from Tel Aviv,
Right.
and I usually land in 6 a.m. And it's one of the only places that is open. And but I just like it. It's quiet. It's nice to have a good breakfast, like a good eggs Benedict,
Nice.
for a nice cup of coffee after a long flight. That's usually my go-to. It's not that amazing, but it's just a fun place located in the kind of the center of SF that I like to go to.
That's pretty awesome, and thanks for sharing that as well, man. By the way, I think that that brings us to the end of the show as well. I think everyone enjoyed the session so far as well. I've got comments from Tom Pike as well. Great insight. It's like an authorization onion. So many layers of complexity to think about. It's so true, my friend.
Yeah.
And Vinny's also enjoyed the great session as well. I think
Thank you, everyone.
where can people find you? Clearly, they want to. There's a lot of people who want to reach out to you as well and get some more information about, I guess,
Yeah. So you
demystifying
guys.
authorization. Where can they find you?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me both on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm on both of them. I'm just Orweis, Orweis. Should be easy to find. And in those communities I mentioned before, both on OPA and Opal, you'll find me rather quickly under the same name, my name. And I'm always happy to engage with fellow developers, fellow designers, people that are working on this problem or similar problems. Really, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And that brings us to the end of the show. So, for people who may be coming in and watching to the end of it, this is kind of where we talk. This is kind of some of the topics we talk about every week, cloud security. And if you might find, if you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, I'm going to leave a few links over here so you can follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe to the YouTube channel. But I will see you on the next time. And thank you all for coming in. I really appreciate you hanging
Thank
out with
you.
us
It was fun.
and maybe having us in the middle of the night as well. So, thank you so much for doing that. I
My
would
pleasure.
see you hopefully soon again on the episode, maybe on another authorization layer topic. But before we do that, for now, thank you. And thank you everyone else who are watching. Goodbye. And I'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.